Hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Selvi. Today's topic is related to the best practices uh, that are used in user stories. It's a very practical scenario, so I am also going to explain with what exactly happens when really we are looking from the user stories point of view. Okay, so let's first try to understand we know what are user stories. So I request you all, if you have not listened to the user stories part 1 and part 2 episodes, kindly listen to those episodes and come to this episode. This will be really helpful for you to understand. Now coming to what are the best practices. First thing, can I create a testing based user story? This is a very common question that many places you can hear this question. I am going to tell this as a very simple best practice for this is task testing is a task. It's not going to give any logical outcome. What is logical outcome? For example, when we are completing a user story, when we say the definition of done is met, that means that particular story, if I deploy it in the customer site, it should work without any kind of dependencies or without any blockers. That means what is the functionality that it is intended to deliver, that should get delivered at the client side. If I do for login page, I am creating a story called I will do testing of the login functionality. What is the logical outcome? Is there without the development, what testing alone will give a value? It's not going to give a value. So testing is a task. It cannot be a user story. Point number 1. Point number 2. Can I create an user story for back-end development, and can I create a user story for front-end development? Which means, can I create a story separately to design my page, and can I create a separate story to write the back-end logic? Let's consider an example. If I am following this methodology, which means I have one dedicated story for front-end development. That means the developer will be picking up that story, design the page. Login page means username, password, the relevant text field, submit button, cancel button. Done. This is the story expectation, right? So it's done. Now the testing is also done. When I enter username and password and click on submit, what will happen? Nothing, because backend logic is not implemented. If I deploy this in the client side, what value they are going to get? There is no value, because it has only a layout which is available in the page. So it is not going to give any value. Let's consider the other side. I am implementing the backend logic. There is no front end. There is no UI. Where is the page where user can enter the username and password to get the value? There is no place. So what will happen? In this case, there is no value, even if we deploy at the customer side. So there cannot be a separate user story for you front end and separate user story for back end. It should have all the relevant tasks that should get implemented, so that we will be getting the logical outcome. That means we will be able to get the functionality. What is our best practice point number 1? Always create user stories in such a way that all the task items should be part of the user story, and a user story should not be owning a task, which means we should not create an user story only for testing. Best practice point number 1. Best practice point number 2 is we should not create an user story separately for front end and separately for back end, because these are also again tasks within a user story. Third one, can I add multiple goals associated to an user story? This we have already touched upon this in our first episode of the user story. Every user story should be associated at least with a goal. There should be a goal. Why are we doing that functionality, or why are we doing that user story, there should be some value, there should be some goal. It is always advisable and suggested not to associate multiple goals in a single user story. The reason is it is hard to track, and there are also chances that we may dilute the purpose of one of the goals. So what is the third best practice? Always associate a goal to the user story, and the best suggestion is not to associate multiple goals to a single user story. Fourth point, can I add a separate user story for automation task, test automation task relevant to that functionality? Test automation, if it is actually getting followed in a project, in a sprint team, that means we need to manage this as a task level. Test automation is a task, it cannot be a story. So whenever, for example, the login page we are developing means, we should plan in such a way, we are starting the design, we are starting the UI work, we are starting the backend work, we are doing the manual testing, we are checking the feasibility for automation, we are writing the code for automation, we are delivering that automation piece, then we claim that it is definition of done. So we need to ensure, if automation is also a part of your sprint deliverable, or your scrum team is going to work on that, it should not be taken as a separate user story. There are chances, let me tell you, there are some places where we will be deviating in practical scenarios. Let's take one example. You have separate set of team members who are working on automation testing, and there are separate set of people who are working on manual testing. What will happen in real case? In some projects, we may not be able to really understand what are the feasible test cases that we can pick it for the automation in the same sprint, which means the developer has completed the work, the developer has given the functionality for testing, the manual tester is testing the piece of functionality, and after this only we will be able to do the feasibility analysis, which means whether this can be automated or not, that will be taken care after that, or maybe in the initial few days of the sprint. There are chances, if manual testing itself is not passing, there are high chances the stability of the code is not great. When the stability of the code is high, when we can say the testing is getting passed. The reason is, when we have lot of bugs, or when we have lot of observations identified in a piece of code, there are high chances that we may again need to rework on the code, and the code stability may go for a toss. So it is always advisable to do the test automation activities on the stabilized code. When we will get the stabilized code? When manual testing is completely done and without any issues identified. Or if there are any issues identified also, they are not breaking issues, or they are not blockers, or they are not high severity issues. They may be cosmetic or nice to have issues. Now, to reach all this place, like to reach this stability, it may take some sprint time. So it is always also a good practice in practical scenario. You complete your manual testing and claim with the definition of done of that story in the previous sprint. That is, for example, in sprint 1, login page is getting developed and it is getting tested manually, and we are completing that user story. Next sprint, create a separate story for automation. Even though it is not advisable for separately creating stories, it is always good to manage your test automation activity also as part of your user story. But in certain cases, there are chances the code is not yet get into the level of maturity or stability. We are in a very new product phase. The product is getting developed in its very early stage. So it is very hard to attain that stability very quickly. So in those cases, we cannot wait and make the stories available all the time just to ensure the test automation. So we can also take this deviation in practical scenarios. So we need to be really careful when we are taking this deviation, until and unless we don't have an option, and every time because of test automation the stories are getting spilled over, that is the time we need to take this option, because we feel that stability of the code is not yet achieved. Otherwise it is not a good practice to create separate stories for test automation. So just to revise, we have seen 4 best practices so far. The first one is related to the testing activity. Do not create separate stories which are relevant to task. Like, for example, do not create user stories to test some functionality, only testing the functionality. Second best practice, do not create user stories to handle only UI work or backend work, which means only for front end or only for backend, do not create user stories. Third best practice is always ensure that there is a goal associated to the user story. And it is also advisable not to associate multiple goals with an user story, which may dilute the whole purpose. Fourth option is, if there is a test automation activity is also taken care by the Scrum team in the sprint, if there is a code stability that has been achieved and the manual testing is already passed, if the stability of the code is well in the product, then it is good to have the test automation task as well as part of the same functionality user story. But in cases where we cannot achieve the stability of the code within the sprint time and it is also a new product development, that is the time we need to postpone this test automation related activity as a separate user story in the upcoming sprint, so that we have the stability of the code that has been already achieved by the manual testing. Last and final best practice. This is one common another scenario. We tend to use this user story as a placeholder. I always keep on repeating this statement. You should have a logical value or logical outcome from a user story. Otherwise, we should not create a user story. So in some places, we tend to use this user story as a placeholder to combine some 10-15 bugs, defects. Okay, we have good amount of defects in our product backlog. We want to really take those as part of our sprint execution. What we will be doing, create one user story, associate all this, link all these defects in that user story, and estimate this user story. This is not a placeholder. Okay, so the last and final best practice is, user story is not a placeholder. And to be very specific, user story is not a placeholder to manage defects. Defects is a separate work item. Right? So now we have covered 5 best practices. I think we are very good to connect with all the best practices with practical examples. I think hopefully this would have helped most of you people. Happy learning. Thank you so much and stay tuned.